I want to call you back now to something we discussed just a little while ago. W.E.B. Du Bois and the concept of double consciousness, that idea of fragmentation, particularly in the African American community in America, the, the breaking apart of one's psyche into multiple parts that it is difficult to unite, and which I discussed in context of Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man, as also really applying to the idea that a black person in America in the 20th century, and indeed still in the 21st, has to have a concept of themselves, but also see themselves through the eyes of the majority, and really at all times be aware of what that other perception is. And I told you to kind of store that away and bear that in mind, that we would be coming back to it. And this is where we're going to do that. We're going to do that in context of the story of Emmett Till, who was a 14-year-old black teenager who lived in Chicago. Now, Chicago had its race problems. In fact, it was infamous for its race problems. Remember A Raisin in the Sun. But it was still a different environment than the Deep South, like, say, for example, Mississippi, which is where Emmett Till's mother had been born. She was a part of the Great Migration that had moved northward, and she had wound up in Chicago, but her family was still in Mississippi. So, in the summer of 1955, over summer vacation from school, 14-year-old Emmett Till took a trip down to Mississippi to stay with relatives during the summer. Now, I said it's a different environment. Someone who was 14 years old, African American, and born and raised in Mississippi would have been probably very well aware of, well, the dangers, the daily dangers of how you are perceived by the majority. Um, Till Emmett, not so much in the same way, coming down from Chicago. And there was an incident. There was an incident that we really don't know the exact details of, because there have been so many different versions of the story. And those versions have themselves been morphed into different versions and so forth. But what we do know is that a white woman, a young white woman who was the wife of a store owner, claimed that Emmett Till had behaved inappropriately toward her. There are, again, different stories that he whistled at her, or that he made what she interpreted as a lewd comment. She also said that he had grabbed her by the waist and said obscene things to her, although later, and by later I mean more than 50 years later, she confessed she had made that part up. So we don't know exactly what happened. He did something that a white woman in Mississippi would have viewed as insulting, offensive, or inappropriate. And no doubt it was something that either would not have been viewed that way in Chicago, or if it had been, it would have been a minor thing. It was not a minor thing in Mississippi in 1955. And that woman's husband and several of his friends drove to Emmett Till's uncle's house where he was staying at night and grabbed the boy, abducted him, just grabbed him and took off with him. And he was never seen alive again. His body was found. He had not only been murdered, he had been tortured. Now, please don't misunderstand what I'm saying. I am not saying that Emmett Till did anything wrong, um, and that what happened to him was in any way his fault, or the fault of his parents, or the fault of his own community. It was, it was the fault of evil. racists in Mississippi. That's what it was the fault of. It was also the fault of a deeply, deeply flawed and unjust system, not just a legal system, but a cultural system in place in this country for centuries. So don't think I'm saying that. But I do want you to be aware. I want you to think about this. If you're not African American, if you're not black, and you're one of my students, maybe you've thought about this stuff before, and maybe you haven't. Maybe you've never thought about it from this perspective, from the perspective of the black community. What I want you to think about and be aware of is, well, what is sometimes referred to as, quote, the talk. The talk that black parents give their children in America. And this is a painting from 2014 called The Talk, in which they make their kids aware that life is dangerous in America if you don't have white skin. It can be very dangerous. A few years ago, LeVar Burton, maybe you've heard of him, was talking on a talk show about having to give the talk to his own son. Now, LeVar Burton is famous for, he's an actor, he's a famous actor. I imagine he's pretty well off financially. He's famous for being in Roots and for being in Star Trek and for Reading Rainbow, which is probably how most of my students know him. And he was talking about how, despite all that, he had to give his teenage son the talk and make sure he was aware that if he's out with his friends and if his friends are all white and he's out with his friends and they're just being teenagers and doing things teenagers do and they have an encounter with the police, he had to tell his son, make sure he understood, he cannot behave the same way the white kids can behave, because something that might get a white kid a stern warning could get him shot and killed. And that is a daily reality in America, and it has been for a long time. And again, it's something that if that's not your experience, you may not even be aware of it. You may have never thought about it, but you have to be aware. You have to be aware. All right, now, this next part is something that I always kind of wrestle with myself over, and that is over just how much to tell, how much to reveal, how much to show, because I don't want to, I don't want to traumatize anybody. I don't want to trigger anybody. I don't want to sensationalize the suffering of the Till family in any way. But at the same time, I want my students to get the full impact and the full import of what we're talking about. And Emmett Till's mother felt the same way. Okay, brace yourselves. After Emmett's body was discovered, the local authorities were about to bury him right there in Mississippi, but his mother, Mamie Till, insisted that he be sent to Chicago for a funeral to be held and a burial to be held there in Chicago. The funeral director warned her that they should have a closed casket because of the condition of the body. Mamie Till insisted that they have an open casket burial. She said, "There's no way I could describe to people what's in that box, and I want the whole world to see what happened to my baby." Thousands of people in Chicago filed through during the visitation and saw the body, and photographs were taken, which were not published in major newspapers or magazines around the country, but were published in the Chicago Defender, which was a black newspaper. And again, I've mentioned this before. It sounds weird that even newspapers and magazines could be segregated, but it was published for a black audience. And also Jet Magazine, which is I'm pretty sure still around. That is a magazine that is published and that is geared toward a black audience. So these pictures got circulated in the black community, and even though the pictures weren't in the paper, all the papers around the country carried this story. Now, there were lynchings in Mississippi and in the Deep South, and had been for a long time. Now, they had slowed down. In fact, we talked earlier about how by the early 50s, there was even a year where there were none, but they still happened. And when they did, they might make the local news, probably not front page, but they certainly didn't make national news. The fact that Emmett Till's mother had his body sent to Chicago rather than buried in Mississippi made it possible for thousands of people to see that body and for the news to be distributed widely. Okay, so this is the part. This is the part that I always hesitate about. So if you are triggered by this type of thing, you might want to skip ahead. But here it is. This was somebody's little boy. All right, that's enough. The two men charged with kidnapping and murdering Emmett Till were tried before a jury of their peers, that is, 12 white guys in Mississippi, who acquitted them after deliberating for 1 hour and 7 minutes. One of the jurors said they would not have taken nearly that long if not for the fact that they took a break and drank some soda pop. After the acquittal, and by the way, they were acquitted of the kidnapping even though they admitted on the stand that they kidnapped him. After the acquittal, those two guys gave an interview to Look magazine, and because they were protected by double jeopardy, you cannot be tried twice for the same crime, even if new evidence comes to light. They went ahead and admitted that they killed him. One of them said, "What else was I supposed to do?" He acted like he thought he was as good as any white man. This is probably the 30th time I've given this lecture, and I always have trouble getting through it.